everyone, and welcome to Milwaukee's Tailgate Brewers podcast, part of the MKE Tailgate Network. This is episode 368. I'm James. I'm joined by Ryan as we do this on a Tuesday night, a rarely scheduled Tuesday night, but we're doing it because we have a special guest this week, and we had some scheduling things to figure out. Jonathan Judge, Baseball Prospectus, the guy behind PECOTA, joins us this week. Doing the rounds, I guess. Jonathan, how you been?
Good, thank you. Is this my first time on this podcast?
It might be.
I think you were on with Steve and Jim and I back in the day.
Oh, that's
First since I've hopped on, so
Okay.
at least 5 years.
Yeah.
It's been a minute since you've been back.
Yeah, we
the
need to do this more often.
James
I don't know
era.
why. Yeah, I need to do more scheduling of guests that know more than we do, and you would definitely qualify in that. So we need to get more people like you in here to do stuff. But I was gonna say, this is a throwback. We used to record on Tuesdays. When we started, for some reason, I don't remember exactly why, but Steve, Jim, and I, we always recorded on Tuesdays. So this is like a throwback to the very beginnings of the podcast.
Yeah, aligning the schedules of three different people always is a little bit tricky, as we know with Paul and Jonathan. Even had to put this back a day just because real life happenings. But good to have you on. So similar to if you heard Jonathan on Kurt and JR's podcast, we're going to be talking all things PECOTA this week. We've got some questions from patrons, both about PECOTA and just some general ones too that we'll get Jonathan's take on. And we'll hop right into it. But a reminder, first of all, as always, for those of you who aren't patrons, you can become one at patreon.com/MKE Tailgate. $2 a month guarantees you get your questions answered both on this podcast and on Reporting as Eligible, which just wrapped up their Super Bowl episode this week. Go take a listen to that if you haven't already. $5 level gets you that perk plus the additional exclusive content, including the Minor League Extra with Ryan and Spencer. Going to want to sign up as we get closer and closer to spring training. There's going to be a lot of minor leaguers on the spring training roster. If you saw the spring training roster they released today on Tuesday. So good to know some of those guys. I imagine you'll be talking about them through spring training and as we get ready for the minor league season in earnest. So good time to sign up for that as well. All right. So as we mentioned, Jonathan's here because PECOTA team projections came out in the last week. And also I'm going to hold it up, even though it's not a visual medium, but I got my annual in the mail over the weekend. So good timing for that. I enjoyed reading the player capsules there as always. Kurt also writing the Brewers essay, doing a really good job on that. If you haven't picked it up already, be sure to go over to baseballprospectus.com and order one. Definitely worth it. But it's been about a week now since the PECOTA team projections hit the internet, and Brewers fans got to indulge in our now, I guess, nearly annual freak out over why PECOTA hates the Brewers and I don't know if we want to say low projection. I think I see where the numbers come from, but little less rosy than maybe you would have expected coming off a division winning year. We're going to talk about that. But if you haven't seen, as of Tuesday morning, we double checked, still projected for 80.5 wins. So basically 500 and a second place finish, a full 10 games behind the Cubs, who are projected for 90.9 wins. Cubs obviously did a lot of improving over the offseason. And also were just, as Jonathan mentioned on Kurt and JR's podcast, comically unlucky last year. So probably going to rebound a bit, but we'll jump into that in a little bit. Obviously this comes on the heels of the 78.5 win projection they had last year. They ultimately won 93 games. In 2023, they had a 87.6 win projection, but still surpassed that with 92 wins. You got to go all the way back to 2022, I guess, to find a Brewers team that failed to reach or surpass that projection, when PECOTA tagged them as a 93 win team before the season, and they ended with only 86 and missed the playoffs. So I guess with all that, Jonathan, we know how PECOTA looks at the Brewers. We've been looking at this for a while now. How do you, as the guy behind PECOTA, see the Brewers? And I guess were you kind of surprised to see where the projections landed after all those simulations?
I'd say a little bit. I mean, I would have put them mid 80s myself, and I think they have some aspects that are just challenging to project because of their tendency to favor younger guys who are starting out, guys who have maybe either had a very rapid ascent or sort of got rapidly improved. And so even if they have suddenly improved, they still have their legacy of previous behavior sort of being held against them. And so I would say sort of mid 80s. I mean, I think there are some aspects of the projection that are actually somewhat optimistic, arguably, for the Brewers. So we have to kind of keep those in mind as well. Like, I think we have Brandon Woodruff throwing a lot of innings, which would be great if true. But, I don't know if that's going to happen or if it's, going to be that many innings. And so if he doesn't have his innings, then someone else has to slide into that. But on balance, I think there are some reasons to believe that some of the changes that we made might not be as fair to the Brewers as I would like them to be, or probably will be by next year. I also think that because they are so defense dependent, that the challenge in projecting defense is going to hit them hardest, because they were our best defensive team last year by a long shot. And I suspect that's going to get better. If anything this year, certainly not going to get worse. So there are a couple, and, just some of these players are just really tricky. And I, on balance, think that's going to work out in their favor, but it might not. So there's really no other team that you have to tune in to actually find out what you're going to get this year than the Brewers. And so, as usual, they're laying the groundwork for that.
Yeah, so you mentioned some changes that were made and that will be made next year that maybe would favor the Brewers. Can you go into that at all, or is that like trade secret still at this point?
No, that's fine. So this year, one of the things that we had been, I guess I should start by saying that it's amazing how many new ideas, measurements, concepts that I sit down and try to incorporate end up making absolutely no difference. And part of that is just the problem. If you have, fundamentally, you are what your results are, more or less, especially over time. And that's true for almost everybody. And so the likelihood that something that we've decided to just measure now or measure in more detail is going to magically tell everyone that you actually sucked all these years when you were winning a bunch of games and throwing 110 strong innings, etc. It's just not very high. But this was an exception because as pitchers have, we've gotten a lot better at finding ways to quantify them. And this year, when I was looking at it pretty much detail, it was very clear that looking at pitch quality metrics made a huge difference in at least one area, balls in play. In other words, run values of balls in play. It made no difference in a lot of other areas, which I think is interesting. The two areas that seemed to matter the most were balls in play and foul balls, which strikes me as maybe a rainy day project, but not otherwise that interesting. So for balls in play, though, it seemed to be making a difference. And when I started scoring the effect of doing the with and without change, we were improving by hundreds of runs. And that is a staggering amount in this line of hobby. And so on balance, what we were doing was really suddenly doing much better. Not we were doing poorly, but you know what I mean. You just like, wow, that's a lot of runs. The only flip side of it is that whenever you incorporate something new, something that some teams are good at, some teams are less good at, you're going to sort of, very rarely are those benefits evenly distributed across everyone. And I think a team like the Brewers that for a little bit was really focused on stuff enhancement, if you will, trying to here's your new pitch today, go down to Arizona, come back with one of those. I think that's kind of become a less of an emphasis, if only because it's so ubiquitous now. And I think they have become much more of a context team. And so we have our Arsenal based metrics came out recently. And if you read that story, you saw that Tobias Myers was sort of exhibit A for how he's put it all together very quickly, and his arsenal effects were a key component of that. So you can kind of look at him and say, well, if I'm grading all these people, or Savali, or these folks who seem to kind of survive somehow, if I'm grading them solely on the pure stuff they bring to the table, that's not going to help them very much. Or they're going to do okay, but they're not going to get rated as highly as they might. Once we start taking into account how well they use context, how well they mix pitches, how well their pitches play with each other, I think that'll help them a little bit. And I would be surprised if it didn't go into effect by next year. But who knows? Maybe I'll try that and find out that it makes no difference. So we'll see.
So the first question that we have here for you from a Patreon listener, you kind of just touched on this a little bit, but maybe we'll be a little more explicit about it. So Michael Parr was asking, what do the Brewers do well that consistently has PECOTA missing them on the low side? Is it something in particular to the Brewers themselves, or is it a known hole in the system that's just difficult to fix? Is it a bunch of different things? Like what are we looking at here?
So I wouldn't say that they are consistently missed on the low side. I think if you go back to 2016 or so, it's pretty evenly divided. And so I think also you have to remember that win projections at almost any website, it's about plus or minus 5, plus or minus 6 wins.
Yeah.
So it really is far more about the order of the teams than it is about the number of wins. Within reason, if it's 105 wins or something, that's not just about the order of the teams. But so I guess the premise I wouldn't really agree with. I do think there are things that the Brewers do that are helpful and make them trickier. I think they tend, as I alluded to earlier, to rely on players who have trickier track records, or are being sort of asked to do something different that the team feels they'll be able to do more successfully. I think that their pitchers tend to rely on the defense a lot, and that is something that is going to get the pitcher probably penalized a little bit sometimes, and other times it's going to be hard for the defense to not get projected to take a step back, given that it's defense. But in terms of things they do particularly well, and this somewhat goes with what I just said, I've mentioned before that I think they get more out of the bottom 3-4 spots on the roster, the 25-man, than anybody else. And they are constantly hunting for and finding guys who just seem to show up and contribute and do something. Your Jared Koenigs and Brian Hudson's, for one example, this person in independent ball, that person who was a cast off that they managed to fix. So I think their ability to sort of constantly get the most out of those spots is one reason why they tend to get a few extra wins more than they would. Otherwise, I think PECOTA has shown some inability to comprehend how much the Cubs will implode at any given time. And
love to hear that.
It has been kind of astonishing on occasion. And so we certainly don't forecast that. This is literally how you look like on paper. And I think maybe that's the most important point to drive home, which is that it's an incredibly useful exercise to see what your team looks like on paper before you really go to work on how you're using people, how you're sequencing people, who you're starting, who you're really including or not including. And, on paper, it's just not that great. It's fine. They are a notably above average pitching team for the NL and a notably below average hitting team in the NL. And you'll never guess how those two balance out in terms of the projected record. So, I think that sounds about right. I can see where they would be hitting a lot more. But it's hard for them to sort of get pegged right on when there are just a lot of these younger developing players who tend to just kind of make a jump when they do or never at all. And, you just like, okay, we will just wait and see.
I do think it's always important to remember that PECOTA and frankly, all the other projection systems too, this is like an average of tens of thousands of simulations, right? So like this is the most likely outcome. But what I really appreciate about BP's standings and depth charts is that you have included sort of like the graphs of all the possible outcomes. So you can kind of see if there's a really long tail, so to speak, that, hey, there are some high error bars here, or you can kind of see where the overlap is, say, between the Cubs and the Brewers in terms of winning percentages. It's always good to remember that there are some simulations that the Brewers do end up winning 95 games. Like that is a thing that happens. It's just not likely. And that's what's important to keep in mind with these.
Yeah. You would not put your 401k on it. And usually you shouldn't. You would be delighted if it happens. So.
Yeah. I guess briefly talked about some of the limitations of projecting young players. Adam Post on Patreon has our next question asking, how do projection systems try to project young elite players like Jackson Chourio that have such a small track record? I think Chourio is especially challenging for you and others, right? Because it's not like he even had that long of a minor league track record to go back on. He literally exploded over the case of 12, 18 months, and you've really got nothing. And historically speaking, the number of guys to come up at 20 and do what he's done is very tiny, and they can't all be Bryce Harper. So I guess, how do you handle that?
Some would say we handle it poorly is how we handle it. But this is one of those situations where if you were to go strictly by batted ball data over the last couple of months or something, and sort of use that and say, well, that's what we should go by, and not pay attention to the lengthy track record or whatever. That's unfortunately how you get cleaned out. When you kind of look at that and say, hey, so-and-so has been trending positive, clearly they will continue trending positive next year. So we really look at sort of recent performance, and someone like Chourio is going to be really hard because unless we are converting to a strictly measured performance system, which is something that teams can do because they have StatCast data going all the way down to the lowest levels, and we do not. So we have to go kind of by raw results and try to adjust for the context, but the models are much better at downgrading 20-year-olds than they are at promoting them and saying, well, if you're doing this now, then, wow, you're going to be great. And another thing about him is that, for example, at AAA, he had a good little run there, but he spent most of his time at AA. That's probably the level he spent as much time at, if not more than any other. And he actually didn't do that well there. And it was where he racked up a whole bunch of plate appearances, and he did fine. And he did great for AA with that environment. But that's kind of a hard thing when that's your largest sample. So you have all of these minor league seasons that are already being downgraded because they're at a lower level of competition. You don't have that many of them. And you have the fact that he's not just sort of performing in the way he is capable of performing. He's learning at the same time and learning very rapidly. So the long and short of it is that it's just, nowhere near what I think he would be at. And I look at something like that and I sigh and I say, the moment you go in there and start putting your finger on the scale for a guy like that, you're going to be sorry you did. And so we just kind of note that on paper, someone like that is going to be at first getting a pretty low projection, and that if they start hitting, largely do pick up where they left off, their rest of season projection is going to jump pretty quickly, just because they have shown the ability to do it, but they haven't done it for long enough that they're going to get the vote of confidence coming into the season, I think.
Yeah, I think Szymborski has talked about that too with players like Chourio, that it's just, they're a hole in the system, and they're just hard to adequately sort of project. So sort of building on that, because a lot of the players I'm about to mention are also in this boat of being young players without huge track records, but some of them have longer track records too. I was looking at the 50th percentile PECOTA projections to get ready for this, and it struck me how many guys on this team are projected for between a 284 and a 303 on base percentage? Churio falls into that. Terang falls into that. Ortiz, Frelick, Mitchell, Hoskins, Dunn. All of these guys are projected between 284 and 303, and Sal's the only one who just barely scrapes over the 300 mark.
Mm-hmm.
If that happens, they're in huge trouble offensively, right? Like if that really is where we are, it's a huge problem, right?
So I think in looking at those numbers, I thought some of them might be a little higher than that, but even if so, maybe not by much, so it doesn't really matter. But yeah, I mean, I think we would be, and that's just sort of the challenge of it. That's that if the Brewers thought that's how they would all play or play on average, they would probably not be playing them, or would rather try not to play them. So yeah, I think again, Ortiz has only been, had one full season. Frelick had one season where it seems like he was injured most of the time. Something was not quite right. Terang is Terang. Churio, we've already kind of talked about. Mitchell is an enigma, but a promising one. And it kind of just goes to the fact that there's reason to suspect that a lot of these folks will hit their 70th or 80th percentile projection rather than the 50, recognizing that at least one or two of them will do the opposite of that. And, but betting on them all on average to do that is just, it's kind of tough to do, but I remain cautiously optimistic overall. And it's just, they have made a very conscious organizational decision to let the kids play, and sometimes you do have to do that, and then it's sort of like, well, let's go. And we're almost certainly going to see some leaps, and we'll see where they are, and hopefully they're in the right places.
Yeah, sorry, those numbers were from when James put that together right when PECOTA first ran right before Christmas, I think. So actually, those are almost 2 months old at this point. So
they might be very close. I'm not saying they aren't. I just was looked at one or two of them, and I'm like, well, but it's again, they're not 320, they're not 340, right? So right. I think the concern is the same.
Yeah, I always struggle with the on-base percentage thing because I learned on-base percentage when the league average was like 330, 340-ish. And now it's like, what, 315, 320-ish? And so to adjust, under 300 used to mean this player is horrible at getting on base. And it's still not good.
Great backup catcher,
Yeah, but it's not what it used to be. So it's I always have trouble adjusting back for that. But when I see all those numbers in the 200s, I'm like, oh.
I mean, what you see is a lot of people who, even being fairly bearishly viewed, are basically projecting to be a bit below average to slightly below average with fabulous defense, and that's not a bad combination, because it doesn't take a whole lot for them to become, an extra win or two there. And because the defense is going to be constant, and the offense is almost certainly only going to get a little bit better than that if it's going to vary one way or the other. So yeah, it's definitely more of a floor group than a ceiling group. And that's kind of the challenge.
So you mentioned this guy just briefly a few minutes ago, but PECOTA projects Garrett Mitchell for 525 plate appearances, which would be a big help if he performs like he did last year in about half that amount. But notably, you just called him an enigma. Some would say he haunts you or he tortures you. What is it about Garrett Mitchell that the system struggles with?
So the thing that is most difficult about him is the strikeout rate, and we usually your BABIP sort of related existence is largely determined for you, right? If you're a little faster, you'll have a little bit more if you're a batter, but you're going to put balls in play, and they are just most of the time going to find a glove, a glove, a fence, something. And so a lot of what batters tend to do when things are going right is just trying to get enough balls to fall so that they can um, be at least somewhat minimally productive. And so when you are striking out at an over 30% rate, you are already taking 10% of your league average, allocated amount and saying no thanks. And then, you have someone like Mitchell who somewhat complicates this a little bit by also taking his walks. So that's another 10% that gets removed. And then all of a sudden you don't be considering that balls in play are how pretty much all runs are scored. You don't have too many left to do. And so if you are going to get a fairly typical allocation among all the events, you're in trouble, and it's going to have a hard time succeeding. And he confounds that. And Kurt Hogue has some theories on that in terms of his selectivity and how, at least when he's swinging and missing at the right pitches, more or less. Mm-hmm. And which I think there must be something to it. But I have been convinced now, without evidence. I feel like I'm like a New York Times article. Without evidence, Judge says Garrett Mitchell will continue to be extremely good. But I have been convinced for a while that there's something there, that he is just making the most of what he gets to. And the thing is, if that is really what he's doing and he's able to keep doing it, the double-digit walk rate, the power, the speed, he has all sorts of ways to put lipstick on some of these peripherals and actually be pretty effective. So he's just sort of fascinating in that way. But from a projection standpoint, the projection system is going to be pissed that he is striking out that much. And it is just going to be like, I will say that contrary to what people think, a player's, like, say, singles rate is actually a very stable thing for both batters and pitchers. And so if he keeps doing it, I think he's going to start getting credit for it. But when he's really removing so many balls in play to begin with, he really has to have a pretty strong track record, because otherwise he's just going to keep getting pushed back toward having more outs. That's what the system keeps waiting for him to do. And that often is what happens with these unicorn types. It's kind of like the Mark Reynolds 3 true outcome types. They strike out 30% plus of the time, they walk 10+% of the time, and the rest of it ain't great, except for like 20 swings a year. So he seems like he might have the ability to defy that. But I can understand, and certainly I understand, why the system is like, I'm not changing everything I understand about this game for this guy. We'll see how he does.
Yeah. And it really is, it's a sample size thing, because believe it or not, he has 365 plate appearances, and he came up in the second half of 2022.
Yeah.
We're at we're basically half a season's worth of plate appearance over the course of, 2.5 years, basically.
Yeah.
And even going through the minors, he was hurt all the time too,
Mm-hmm.
and missed a 2020 COVID year in the minors. And there's just not a lot to draw on from there either, because he hasn't been on the field.
Yeah. And he plays really hard, and he plays center field a lot of the time. And those are positions that wear you out, as we know from some frustrating examples in the league of the great talents who just can't stay healthy, and they blow you away when they're in, but it's not often enough. So hopefully that's not him. Some of these are kind of freakish injuries, so you'd like to think that they're not going to keep coming back.
So I had kind of a more process-oriented question for you, but I'm going to skip over that, and because I think we're going to run a little long here, so I'm going to try to speed this up a little bit. I got to talk to you about Craig Yoho, because that was one of the first things that jumped off of me off the page at me when I was looking at the player projections. You guys have him throwing only 32 innings, but basically being the Brewers' most effective relief pitcher, and it's not all that close. You have him projected at a 3.32 ERA. The DRA minus and all that was like in the low 80s, so it was like 82-ish. So approaching 20% better than league average in terms of run prevention. Like CFIP was in that same range. This is all better than McGill, better than really anybody else in the bullpen, period. And something James wanted to add in here too. Is this a symptom of some changes you guys have made at BP in terms of weighting a pitcher's stuff or arsenal or something else? Or because this really jumps off the page at me.
Yeah, no. And the answer is no, because I think, well, let me look here. So AAA folks would be included, I believe, in that, but he's got 14 innings there. So that's not,
Right. Not a lot.
And so it's just, the reality is that he's actually the opposite of the Jackson Churio issue, in that he actually has just produced sort of mind-boggling numbers in the lower levels, and you can only discount those by so much, which is arguably a bit of a vulnerability, in that we can only sort of discount you so much before we kind of shrug and say, well, that is, that's a lot of guys, and sort of just let you kind of take it with you. I think it's also difficult because one of my concerns about him, and I think you see this in AAA when his walk rate really jumped, and why would that be? And I suspect, although I do not watch those games, that people know that he's got one nightmare pitch, and the fastball is not maybe setting it up as well as, say, Devin's fastball would. And I suspect, my fear about him is that people will stop swinging, and that the double A, the high A, those guys will swing away. Why not? But when I see AAA people having his walk rate jump up, that makes me think of the crafty vet types who are kind of like, yeah, I know what this guy is. And so his results are such that I think that's really driving the projection. I do have concerns about how well it will translate, but we'll see. And it's certainly something where the Brewers clearly think he's got something in him by the way they moved him around and up. So I think it seems likely that he's going to be showing up this year. So I don't think this is a absolutely crazy projection, but this, he's got all of 1 year essentially besides this, and having 1 year where almost everything goes right is not necessarily the best predictor of your major league career. So I have some trepidation about him, but I will acknowledge it's nice. And it is nice to see that gaudy minor league numbers can really influence a major league projection, which at some level they should, just as long as you aren't too rosy about it.
I wanted to ask about Aaron Ashby, because I think he's really interesting to me this year. Just not even just the PECOTA projection, but just what he could mean to, is he a starter? Is he a swingman? And how does the projection system handle that? But also, he's been historically pretty good in the majors when he's been available, a 3.81 DRA, 86 DRA minus. Last year when he made it back to the majors, granted very limited sample, but that kind of tracks with his overall career production. PECOTA doesn't seem that optimistic though, projecting a 5.24 ERA and a 1.16 DRC minus in about 65 innings this year. So I guess maybe is this like the inverse of Craig Yoho, where is it seeing walks? Is it seeing, command issues? Is that maybe factoring into this? And then I guess, how do you handle the swingman types that you don't necessarily know what their role is going to be?
Yeah. And I think the problem, I don't know if I call it the problem. I mean, he has had this real sort of Jekyll and Hyde thing. We have no data really for 23 due to the injury. In 24, he spent most of it being god awful at AAA, and that's where his volume is. And then he kind of flipped the switch, obviously. Credit to him. Really incredible, frankly. And then he came up, and all of a sudden he's dynamite. And weirdly, his results in the major leagues have been pretty good. At least, we think they're fabulous, and DRA wise. And so there are too many walks there, but the strikeouts are great. And I just don't think, though, that with no 2023 and with that 2024 AAA performance, it's going to hang it. It's going to hang it on you. And
Sure.
I think that's just what it is. He really, I mean, credit to him. It's almost like he's got a bit of a Churio effect going on, in that he's, had this predicate that was kind of tough to give too much positive credit to, and then he suddenly turns it on, and you're like, wow, well, which is that the real guy here? And if it is, then again, it's going to be okay, off you go. But yet another Brewer who and I guess all teams have some of these guys, coming back from something. Are they turning it around? Is it just a flash in the pan? I don't know, but that's why he's tough. In his own sort of unique right, the combination of injury plus that just sort of, I can't hit the broadside of a barn, suddenly converting to I can hit whatever I want, whenever I want, as hard as I want. Any questions? And that's really something. So it's a nice problem to have, because it looked like it was going to be the opposite problem around mid-July, if I recall correctly. And, that we were heading toward something quite sad. And it looks like we're not, which is great.
Yeah, all of a sudden something loosened up in his shoulder, and one day he was just throwing easier and was able to get back up to velocity without the effort that he had to put into it. And it just, all of a sudden one day it just happened, and it like he recovered from that, or something got better. And yeah, it's very hard for a projection system to take something like that into account, right? Where just all of a sudden a player's physical health improves sort of out of nowhere. It's
that's kind of like someone saying I'm just very locked in right now. Well, thanks.
Right.
That's not very helpful. And, and what he's describing certainly checks out. I know that when I go and warm up a little bit, I get like another 10 miles an hour and much more accuracy. So that's totally plausible.
It all tracks. All right. We've got a question from Ryan Ziegler on Patreon. And I guess moving beyond the raw numbers themselves, Jonathan, which team or player escapes the projection and far exceeds or falls way behind this season? Gut feelings only. So I guess when you saw those numbers that PECOTA spit out, what was your first reaction in terms of, oh yeah, he'll beat that, or ooh, that's a little rosy?
So there wasn't really any player that jumped out at me, and it's simply because I just pay very little attention to individual players. It's one of these weird sort of things that all of my individual player attention comes as a fan. And
that's interesting.
All of my interest otherwise in baseball is structural and big picture. And so, I don't go and start checking a bunch of random people. I mean, I check afterward to see who we missed on and wonder why that is. But no one player. I will say the one that really just caused me to nearly gasp was the Rockies standings projection of 55 wins.
That doesn't happen often.
That's that's even by Dick Monfort standards, that's bad. And yet you think about it, and who's going to say no, right? I mean, who do they have pitching? Who do they have hitting? They are finally sort of, even their loyal guys they refuse to get rid of have started to depart, and it's not great. So that was the one that kind of had me just really say, because they always just feel like a team that sort of gets like 75 wins one way or another, and it's sort of like pathetic, kind of like traditional Cubsy before the times got better for them about 10 years ago. Finding a way to kind of be in the mix, and sometimes too often not being in the mix. But I was just, how many games did the White Sox win last year?
42 or something.
Oh, was it that low? Wow. Okay. So they're not anywhere near in that territory, but man, it's the thing that's really sad about it, that's really startling to me, is that I usually expect numbers in that range to be for the teams that I know are consciously either trying to lose or are resigned to losing with the purpose, like the Marlins. But I don't think the Rockies see themselves that way.
No, they don't.
In my mind, they sort of are newly astonished every single time. The same like lack of strategy produces complete non-results, and Bud Black goes back in there, I guess, and he crunches the something or whatever and roll it back out. But man, it's bad, and I guess fans show up for their games anyway, so it doesn't matter to them. But what a weird franchise! My goodness.
Yeah, the White Sox last year were 41 and 121, so they lost 121 games. They went past the Mets, right? That's exceeding the Mets loss total, but they didn't get to the Spiders.
No.
Yeah,
maybe the Rockies can catch the Spiders.
And they actually had to do really well at the end of the season, to pull that off. Oh yeah, the Rockies though, yeah, it's one thing if you're gonna be bad, you better be trying to be bad. If you're just bad and you're not trying to be bad, that's the ultimate sign that you don't know what the hell you're doing. And yeah,
well, a couple of these franchises also are running up against the 3 times rule for being a lottery pick.
The White Sox.
Yep.
The White Sox can't do that anymore. So that's not great for them. The Marlins have got to be in that territory. Or at least they're working on it. I don't think Colorado has been in that territory. So I think they're okay. But you can't just sort of do that anymore and count on getting the pick. And so it's even more befuddling. Maybe it could be just that the old draft rules made the tank fest just sort of more sensible than it otherwise would have been. You became a smart team rather than merely a hapless team that was being patient. It probably still makes sense to sell off and build the same way, whether you get the draft pick for sure or not. But these guys at the bottom, it's something, man.
Yeah, these really truly awful clubs are going to have a harder time digging out than teams did in the past because of those rules that you're talking about. It's just kind of a change. So
it's pretty much only the Astros and Cubs that did it as a strategy and it worked, right? Well, maybe the Orioles.
The Orioles are like the last team to do it. The Brewers kind of did it. Like it seemed like they were going into doing that, and then they were just way better, real fast, way better than anybody expected, really quick. It was like they gutted the system, they gutted the major league club, and over the course of 2015 basically and into 2016, and then by 2017 they're already winning 86 games again. And what the hell? It was really kind of bizarre. Okay, so more Patreon questions here.
Sure.
Baseball needs more chest lettuce. Finish the sentence for me. The Brewers make the playoffs if
if 2018 Yelich is back.
Ooh, okay. That would definitely help. Yeah.
2019, 2018. So
okay.
I would take either at this point. Hell, I would take before he got hurt 2024 Yelich, to be quite honest at this point too.
Oh yeah. I think maybe a slightly less sneaky way to say that would be if he's 85% of the player he was while healthy last year, then yes, I think so. They don't need a couple of wins to come from very many places to surge up. So I think the nice thing is that even though that's certainly one clear option, I think they got a couple of different ways to get there, and which is of course how they like it.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering. I'll run this by you real quick. The Brewers right now, PECOTA has them with a what's the total? 26.1% chance to make the playoffs. I'm surprised though how much of that is wild card. 15.1% of that is wild card, and only 11% of it is division. I still feel like, given the strength of clubs like the Braves, the Mets, the Phillies are all good clubs out in the East, and then you have the Dodgers, Arizona, San Diego are all pretty good clubs out in the West. I sort of feel like the Central is going to have a hard time putting a wild card team into the mix. Maybe that's wrong, but I feel like it's going to be a little difficult for them to put a wild card team into the mix. So I feel like it would make more sense to have like those numbers reversed, and it would be more likely if the Brewers are going to make the playoffs, they're going to need to win the division as opposed to a wild card. What do you think to that?
I think that is a fair assumption to make ordinarily. I also just think though that with the third wild card, there's 300% to split up, and only so many teams who are interested in having any of that percent. I guess if I could go back to your previous question, just because there is something that someone else pointed out to me today that I'm fascinated by, and it's how St. Louis can't seem to decide what they're doing.
Yes.
So they have come back and they have this sort of roll the barrel back out approach, not really selling anybody, not really doing much of anything. And so they come back with 78 wins, which is utterly pointless. And I don't know what they're doing. They should be doing some tear down thing. But they seem as confused as anyone else. So I don't know if that's like the last gasp of the current GM on his way out or what. Sorry, completely jumped off topic, but I noticed St. Louis in the standings again, and I'm like, yeah, that may be the weirdest thing. Which when you're possibly putting that over the Rockies means it's really weird, and I do not understand what St. Louis is doing.
Yeah, they seem to go into the winter thinking they were going to move Helsley and they were going to move Arenado, and they did try to move Arenado to Houston, and he turned it down. That was the crazy part, was he actually shot down the trade. Remember when that happened? That was right around winter meetings time, I think. And they got stuck with him.
Still there.
Yeah.
It's awkward. Yeah. They also haven't signed anybody this winter. They're also in TV limbo, but yeah, just the total reversal of, okay, we're going to grit our teeth and rebuild for 1 year at least, and then reset with Chaim Bloom next year. No, just gonna trudge along, and hell, I don't know. Maybe the division sucks enough that they stumble into another playoff run. But to your point, like at 81 wins, what good does that do you?
I will say that I may be the only person I know who would not mind, especially if the Cardinals get desperate to unload, having Arenado at third for a year or two. But again, we all have to be iconoclasts at something. So.
His offense did really, I have him in multiple dynasty leagues. His offense really fell off. He's still a great defender and a good all-around player, but that offense it's not what it once was.
It did, although in Busch Stadium, I mean, man, although that didn't stop him the year before or the year before that. So
yeah,
could be.
Yeah, he could bounce back, and it wouldn't shock me even a little bit, but yeah, we'll see.
I mean, compared to Andrew Monasterio and Caleb Durbin or whatever, I mean, I would cheerfully roll the dice on him getting a couple of points of slug back. So.
Well, funny you mentioned that, because we have a question from Mark Podscarby I'm going to jump down to on Patreon.
Sure.
Why have the Brewers struggled to find a legit third baseman the last half decade or so? Our leaders in games played at the position the last 5 years are Joey Ortiz, Andrew Monasterio, Jace Peterson, Luis Urias, and Eric Sogard in 2020. This year's plan, yeah, that was a long time ago now.
Jace of MLB, Eric Sogard?
Yeah, and then let's not talk about opinions in 2020 he may have had. This year's plan seems to be a platoon of Oliver Dunn and Caleb Durbin. Do they just not value third base very highly in terms of impact? So, Jonathan, if you could speculate, what do you think?
I think I would just say that they only get players from certain sources, and if the well is dry at the moment and their farm system is not able to give them anybody better, they're just like, well, that's just the way it is. And that's how you end up with offenses like 2020, 2021, 2022, Brian Anderson, et cetera, and at both corner infield positions, it's been like that. And it's kind of like, I don't really know why you would expect anything else. Results wise, I think they just go and find the best piece of sort of quasi flotsam they can and just hope that they've got a year in them or something, and usually they don't. So I don't think there's any real magic to it. It's not like they go out and sign some guy and then are stunned that he doesn't have the magic anymore. A lot of these guys haven't had the magic for quite some time, to the extent they ever had it. And I guess you have to put someone over there. And so they just, I think that's kind of the strategy. I think they have been hurt for a very long time by their inability to bring up not only sort of hitters in general, but infielder hitters, corner infielder hitters. And so that's just kind of what you get. And so I don't know. I think that's really all that it is, as unsexy of an answer as it is.
Well, I think another thing that's going on here is it's people's expectations of third base, where everybody expects really good defense. They want defense like a shortstop, and they want offense like a first baseman. And there's like none of those guys.
Is that so much to ask for?
Yes, it's so much to ask for. I just want Hall of Famers. It's all I'm asking for.
They don't put good or third baseman in the Hall of Fame anyway.
No, they don't. Right. They don't.
I want Summer Aramis for the whole season a couple years in a row. That's so much to ask for.
So. Yes, June Aramis.
And the thing is, if you look at this list, most of these guys are good defenders. Sogard was a good defender. Luis Urias was a good defender. Jace was a great defender. Joey Ortiz is a great defender. So they were kind of prioritizing defense and hopefully we'll get enough hitting out of the position. And that obviously isn't exciting to people, but I think you look at these up and down. Ortiz was worth 2.5 to 3 wins. Urias was a 2-win player for a few years there. Jace Peterson would have been around that with his really good defense. Who knows with Sogard back in 2020 because it was such a short amount of time. But those guys, they were able to produce a decent amount of value just because they were such good defenders. That helps.
Yeah, and I think that might actually get to a related point, which is that they prioritize floor over ceiling. And if they have a person who can make some contact and is a good defender, then they know they're going to get at least one win out of that position, probably, even though they'd like to have more. And so that's a place to start. And it's the no black holes philosophy, which doesn't quite work out that way, of course, every time and at every position, but they really prioritize trying to at least not lose too much value at a position, even if they're not going to have a whole lot of extra value there. Hence the platoons, hence, et cetera.
Yep. So Ian Pomplin wants to know who on the Brewers is poised to take a step backwards and why.
Oh. I am not sure who I think I would nominate for that. Let me take a look here.
I pick Bryce Terang. That seems obvious to me, although he did crash hard already.
He's sort of self-regulating in that respect. So yeah, I don't. Okay, but I'm fascinated by this question, so I want to think about it. Let's see. A lot of people last year just felt like they were, except for relievers, and that's not very exciting. They all were kind of sort of performing, yet underperforming, yet kind of hanging in there. And I just don't see a lot of candidates for that, which is astonishing. I guess maybe I would just say Contreras, because he's really been sort of at the top end of things now at his position, and that's just tough to maintain.
Yeah.
But it isn't because I think he's got problems or anything. It's just because I think that's just sort of eventually something kind of goes back. I mean, we've already seen the defense sort of become either a bit less of a priority or a bit less maintained at the original high level that was created. So I guess I would reluctantly say that, but man, I'm not sure who else I would nominate. Everyone else just felt like to me like they were taking steps back last year, one way or another. And so, yeah, that's probably the best I can do. Sorry about that.
I would have nominated Tobias Myers, but then you guys made him the poster boy for the
right.
The stuff thing, and now I'm like, wait, now I can actually kind of see Tobias Myers being good above what we sort of expect, even though he doesn't have great individual stuff. It all sort of plays nicely together. So yeah, I don't want to pick Tobias Myers now because I was going to go that direction, but not anymore. So that's a tough one.
So I mean, I think it's a good answer to be able to give. I think if they're going to have any variance, it's going to be upward, which is good, which is how they like it. High variance pointing upward, if anywhere.
Bryce throws in our next Patreon question asking who's going to be the quote unquote hold the deficit bullpen arm, aka the Yandel Gustave of 2025. If the Brewers keep their never out of it attitude, they'll need someone to staunch the bleed for comebacks. I would say the good news for Price is PECOTA projects like literally a dozen Brewers pitchers to have above average TRC minuses. So what's your pick there, Jonathan?
Oh, I don't know. It would that see, this is starting to get into the individual players problem Brewers edition.
Yeah.
I don't know. These guys who are like the bottom 4 or 5 guys on the the depth chart. I'm looking at the PECOTA depth chart here. Boy, take your pick. I don't know. But actually the reality is it's probably the easy answer is not currently on the roster because they are going to show up at some point, get shelled 3 or 4 times, and while everyone is at the concession stands, and then they'll be sent off, for to the next team that wants to use them for exactly that same purpose. Oh dear.
Yeah, so Gustave is like the perfect example of this because he was only on the roster for 28 innings in 2022. Yes, he was on the roster for 18 innings in 2021, but it was because he got shuffled on, shuffled off, shuffled on, shuffled off. The answer to the question is there isn't going to be that guy because they don't stick on the roster. They don't stick around. They get shuffled on and shuffled off the roster. That's just the way that this tends to go. So if you have somebody who is actually good doing this, then they ascend into the higher strata of they're actually in, like Koenig was kind of this guy early on last season, and then he became too good for it. So they moved him up in the pecking order and then it became somebody else. So this is like, you're always going to have a couple of bullpen spots that are just shuffling for this purpose. They're just going to be shuffled through. That's how it works. And it's not just the Brewers anymore. The Brewers were one of the first teams to kind of do this in the early Craig Counsell days, but now every team just runs this way. This is just standard in baseball.
Agreed.
All right. Last few questions, Jonathan, and then we'll get you out of here.
That's fine.
Tricky Henderson is asking, as the season approaches, do any or all of you train your ample baseball brains to fantasy? If so, what format do you prefer? Who is your Brewer fantasy darling for 25? And when do you open up a Patreon league? So I guess, Jonathan, do you have time to dabble in fantasy at all?
I could not be less interested in fake baseball. And but I understand that we have many individuals, including supporters and subscribers of our website, for whom we generate much content. And I'm glad they enjoy it so much, is all I can tell you. So you guys, however, I believe do, or at least to some extent.
Yeah, I play quite a bit of Dynasty. I have like 5 different Dynasty teams now. I keep getting roped into a new one every year, so I've got a lot of them. Yeah.
James? I can't do that. No, I tried to do fantasy baseball multiple times years ago, and I just don't have the patience or the concentration to like check it every single day, stream starters, that kind of thing. That's just way too much for me. I do better with fantasy football where I can check it on waiver day and check it on Saturday and be done.
Right.
But fantasy baseball is not for me.
It's high maintenance, as far as I can tell.
There are weekly leagues, and those are preferable to the day-to-day leagues where you got to constantly worry about it. And it's too much. And I keep getting roped into specifically day-to-day leagues where I have to keep checking my damn lineup every day. And I'm like, no, I keep swearing off of this. So no.
And then you have competing rooting interests in so many leagues. I've actually had to like trim down my fantasy football leagues. I used to be in 3 or 4. It was just too much. You're rooting against yourself half the time.
Mm-hmm.
All right. PJ Wessels asking, mostly for Ryan, Everton and Liverpool are both out of the cup, but Liverpool lost to a worse team. So obviously Everton will win this week, right? Never mind playing the kids and such. Are openers and followers something you think the Brewers should use more? Also, if we're doing a Patreon league, might as well do OOTP. Sure. So I guess, Jonathan, followers, how do you feel about that? And is that something that is advantageous or not really with this current setup?
Uh, I think it can have some value if you have. There are a few teams who just stubbornly will not mix their righties and lefties, and um, if they're going to insist on making themselves easier to get out for the best guys in their lineup at the top, okay, I think you kind of take them up on that. But generally speaking, I don't know if I call it a gimmick, but it isn't really something that I worry about that much or tend to think that is being magically underutilized. As I recall, there were just a couple of teams. Maybe I think the Red Sox was one of them, but there were ones where it was just like they just would refuse to disperse their batters, and I seem to recall we took advantage of it and thought it was kind of funny. But you know how managers are sometimes with, so and so, this is his spot in the lineup. He's really touchy. He doesn't. Why is he being demoted? Why is he doing this? And so if you can take advantage of him, by all means. But generally speaking, I think it's far more important to focus on trying to get a guy who can go at least 5 and preferably 6 and turn it over to this bullpen, especially. I think you are in danger of outsmarting yourself otherwise.
Yeah, I did enjoy last year. We saw it a little bit with Koenig, and he would open for Colin Ray. And I think he was also maybe opening a little bit for Tobias Myers.
That's what I was thinking of, yeah.
Yeah, those guys. I'm totally open to the idea in certain situations, especially if, you have a couple of hard-hitting lefties up at the top of the lineup and you want to get a right-handed pitcher out of there and let, a lefty like Koenig come in and do that. If there's a way to take advantage of it, like you said, I'm all for it. But in general, I'm not also like sitting here pounding on the desk saying you need to do this more. It's if they want to do it, it's fine. If they're more comfortable not doing it, I think it's not something you're going to gain leaps and bounds. You can get some marginal advantages from it, but that's kind of as far as it goes.
Yeah.
I just want to see him use some of the 2018 NLCS shenanigans a little bit more frequent. Like
yes.
use a starter as an opener and then just go from there and see what happens. I just like irritating the Dodgers.
Yes. And PJ, to answer your question that you brought up, I am actually legitimately nervous about Everton tomorrow. I think that could turn into a debacle, and I'm not real thrilled about it. So I'm legitimately nervous for you. Just don't break any of our players' legs. Okay. The order goes out. None of the shenanigans we've had in the past. There will be no leg breaking in this game. Then we're not having a repeat of Jordan Pickford in 2020. That nonsense needs to stop.
All right. Last question this week. Lucre Suitcase asking, what reports or news are you looking for as pitchers and catchers report this week? So I don't know. I always like the best shape of his life kind of things. But Jonathan, I guess, is it just how is Christian Yelich doing with his back? Like, that's the number one question for me.
I think so. Now, whether they tell us now or later,
That's true.
I mean, it's really just the RIP sort of news. I mean, Woodruff not being quite ready is hardly a shock, but they kind of wait until people start showing up, and it's just one bit of bad news after another. There really isn't any positive news, except for like kind of, and I think people are now kind of self-conscious about the best shape of his life stuff, so I don't think we get it quite as much anymore, unironically, as we used to. So I think actually it's sort of like in spring training last year. I just kept sit there and waiting for an injury, and it didn't seem to really happen. And I thought that was pretty cool. But it's almost like spring training is a steady stream of sadness in many ways as far as those things go. So that's really kind of depressing because I really am happy that baseball is almost back. But it seems like things pretty much only go wrong in spring training. Am I wrong?
No, I don't think so.
Because the things that go right, everybody's tendency is to go, well,
that's not real.
We're going to have to, it's not real at spring training. We're going to need to see it in the regular season. So only really bad things can happen in spring. Like people can get hurt. People can there could be physical maladies that like make them unavailable.
You could step on a scorpion.
You could step on a scorpion. Yeah. You could, lots of different bad things could happen to you, but anything good, we're going to wait until the regular season starts. And even then for quite a while before we're actually going to believe it. Right? Like, even when something amazing does happen in spring training, think about like when Jose Bautista broke out, and like, but no one in that spring training was like, oh yeah, this is real. Like, Jose Bautista is now an MVP. Well, he was, nobody felt confident in saying it. So I think, yeah, the tendency is that the good things get sort of written off and say, well, we have to wait. And the bad things are more concrete. So, yeah.
Yeah, I as long as we just don't get within a few days of Christian Yelich showing up, oh yeah, he can't bend over and tie his shoes anymore. You know, like that. Let's just avoid that this spring. That's great.
That would be
all
great.
right. Yeah. That is it for questions this week. Thanks to all of our patrons for sending those. Again, patreon.com/MKE tailgate is where you could sign up for $2 a month. And while you're giving people money, Jonathan, where can folks go to subscribe to all of your stuff?
Thank you. Yeah, so they can go to baseballprospectus.com, and we have a variety of subscription options. And notably, we were probably on pace to raise prices this year, which pretty much everyone has to do sooner or later. And we got an impassioned pitch to instead tell people that if more people who actually read it all the time don't subscribe, we will raise the price. So that has actually been pretty effective. So it's a chance to kind of get in now before the pricing, the pricing has remained surprisingly where it is as a part of that initiative. So I think it's from a value standpoint, it's a good time to go check it out. And if you want to get the PECOTA projections, if you want to get those things and download them and have our percentiles from like first percentile outcome to 99th percentile outcome and those cool things, that does require the annual. So that is one of the prices that we held pretty constant. And this is a good time to go take a look at it if you're interested.
Still definitely worth it. I took advantage of the holiday deal you guys had where it was whatever bundle. You get the annual
subscription.
T-shirt? I haven't gotten my T-shirt yet. Ooh. Who do I talk to about that? No, I got the annual. That's all I really cared about. But that's a great deal to be on the lookout for those. So much great work, and thanks, Jonathan, for taking time out to do this. I know you've got a busy life even outside of being master of PECOTA. So definitely appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah.
That'll do it for this week. Reminder, even if you're not a patron, you can support us another way. Go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever else you're listening to this. Give us a 5-star review. While you're there, please be sure to hit the subscribe or follow button to make sure you never miss an episode, especially because spring training is coming up soon. Ryan's got our spring training plans all mapped out, when we're going to do our previews and all of that. We'll share some of that in the coming weeks. But until then, thanks for listening, everybody. Have a good week, and we'll see you next time here on Milwaukee Tailgate. There where the